You ever notice how we're kind of always acting like philosophers? I mean, think about it.
Hmm. How so?
Well, we're always trying to figure out our place in the world, right? Like, what does it really mean to be a good friend or a responsible citizen? How should we treat our family? It's like we're constantly wrestling with these big questions about who we are and how we relate to everyone else.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like we're all engaged in this ongoing philosophical exploration just by living our lives.
Exactly. And today, we're taking that philosophical exploration to a whole other level as we dive into Confucian philosophy and how it understood gender.
It's a topic that's so rich and complex, and thankfully, we have an amazing guide for our deep dive.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on gender in Confucian philosophy. It's seriously thorough and well-researched, which is perfect because we're going to be unpacking some pretty intricate ideas.
And I think what makes this deep dive so fascinating is that we're not just looking at historical ideas. We're also going to be exploring how contemporary feminist thinkers are engaging with Confucianism, which offers some really surprising insights.
All right, so big picture, what are we trying to understand here?
Well, our mission today is to unpack how Confucian thought historically conceived of man and woman. How did they define these categories, and how do those definitions compare to our modern Western understanding of gender?
Because, we often just assume those categories are universal.
Yeah.
But the more you dig into different cultures and historical periods, the more you realize how much those ideas can vary.
Absolutely. And one of the first things that jumps out when you start looking at Confucianism through a gender lens is that the concept of gender as a social construct, the idea that it's distinct from biological sex that doesn't have a direct equivalent in classical Chinese.
So wait, are you saying they didn't even have a word for gender?
Pretty much. The terms Xingbi, which refers to natural differences, and Shihui Xingbi, which means societally constructed natural differences, are actually pretty new additions to the Chinese language.
Wow, I had no idea. When did those terms come about?
They emerged in the 1990s, largely due to the influence of Western feminist thought, and as Chinese scholars were trying to find ways to articulate ideas about social construction that weren't readily available in their classical language. Even nixing, which we might translate as woman or female nature, only appeared in the 1920s.
It's amazing how language reflects these shifts in thought, right? Like how new concepts demand new words.
For sure. And before these terms came about, the understanding of women was much more directly tied to their roles within the family structure.
So it wasn't about woman as this abstract category, but more about her specific role as a daughter or a wife.
Exactly. In fact, the earliest Chinese dictionary defined new woman as being synonymous with fu, married woman. Similarly, nan, man, was often linked to zhengfu, husband. So the emphasis was very much on kinship roles rather than some kind of broader kinship neutral concept of woman or gender.
Okay, so that's a pretty big difference right off the bat.
Yeah.
How have scholars reacted to this kind of linguistic and conceptual gap between gender, as we understand it, and how it was understood or not understood in classical Chinese thought?
Well, there's a bit of a divide. Some scholars, particularly those involved in early Chinese women's movements and contemporary feminists, see this lack of a direct translation for gender as a sign that traditional Chinese thought maybe didn't fully grasp the concept of gender as a social construct.
Like they see it as a potential limitation.
Yeah, some do. But others argue that trying to force Western categories onto Confucian thought is actually distorting it. They say it leads to misunderstandings about how gender dynamics actually functioned within that tradition.
I guess it's similar to the debate about whether translating Ru as Confucianism is accurate, or if we're imposing our own categories on something that's fundamentally different.
Precisely. So, right from the start, we have to be really careful about the language we're using and how it might be shaping our understanding of these complex ideas.
So speaking of language and categories,
Yeah.
one of the first things that often comes to mind when people think about gender in Chinese thought is the concept of yin and yang. How did that fit into all of this?
It's a common starting point, but it can also be really misleading when we're talking specifically about gender in Confucianism. While it's true that yin is frequently associated with femininity and yang with masculinity, we have to remember that yin and yang are ultimately part of a much broader cosmological framework.
It's about this dynamic balance of opposing forces in the universe, right?
Mm.
How seemingly opposite things are actually interconnected and interdependent.
Right. It's a way of understanding the fundamental duality of existence. But some scholars have pointed out that in certain Confucian texts, like Dongzhongshu's luxurious dews of the spring and autumn, there's actually an emphasis on the superiority of yang and the inferiority of yin.
So even within Confucian thought, there wasn't necessarily a single unified view of how yin and yang related to gender.
Definitely not. And this is where things get tricky because that idea of yang being superior to yin has definitely been used to justify patriarchal interpretations of Confucianism.
Which makes sense, right? If you associate masculinity with yang and femininity with yin, and then you say yang is superior, it's not a huge leap to say men are superior to women.
Exactly. But the thing is, at its core, yin-yang is about achieving harmony and balance, not about one force dominating the other. So it's a limited lens through which to understand gender dynamics in Confucianism. It doesn't really fully explain how those power dynamics were constructed and maintained.
Okay, so if yin-yang isn't the primary way Confucianism looked at gender, what is? What was the framework they used?
Well, you mentioned it earlier. It's the concept of naiwei, which translates to inside-outside. This idea of distinct spheres is really central to how Confucianism understood gender roles.
And we're not just talking about physical spaces here, right?
Mhm.
It's about these broader social and even philosophical categories.
Right. It's about where your place is in society, what roles you're expected to fulfill, and how you're supposed to behave. In Confucianism, becoming a man or a woman wasn't just about biology. It was deeply intertwined with embodying specific familial and social roles through ritual learning and practice.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just about being born male or female, but about actually performing these roles that are associated with those categories.
Exactly. And this idea of ritualization was fundamental to Confucian thought in general. It wasn't just about gender, it was about becoming human and civilized.
Like these rituals were seen as the foundation of a harmonious society.
Precisely. Confucian thinkers like Sunzi really emphasize that. And this ritual differentiation, known as lidi, was what they believed separated humans from animals. By establishing these clear social distinctions, including distinctions between men and women, they created order and structure in society.
So where does this why this inside-outside division fit into all of this?
Well, according to the Book of Changes, this spatial binary underpins all human relations, from the family to the state. Women are associated with ne, the inside, while men are associated with wei, the outside.
It's like a cosmic blueprint for social order, where everyone has their designated place.
Yeah, that was the idea. If everyone stayed in their proper sphere and fulfilled their designated roles, everything would be in harmony. But of course, that idea has huge implications for how men and women were treated and the kinds of opportunities they had.
So what did ne and wei actually mean in practice? What were the concrete roles and expectations attached to each sphere?
Well, it's important to note that ne wasn't necessarily seen as inferior to wei. It was more about different but complementary spheres of influence. Ne represented a focused center, the domestic realm, and was primarily associated with household management and the roles of wife and mother. Wei, on the other hand, was more expansive. It encompassed things like scholarship, government, and roles outside the immediate family.
So men's lives were more public-facing, while women's lives were more centered on the home and family.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And this division of spheres started incredibly early. We see it reflected in everything from the toys children were given to the types of education they received. The Book of Songs and the Liji actually provide some concrete examples of this. Boys might get scepters to play with, symbolizing their future roles as officials, while girls would receive weaving tools representing their domestic duties. And by the age of 10, boys would be sent off to school for more formal education, while girls would largely stay home to learn the skills necessary to be good wives and mothers.
Wow. So it wasn't just that these roles were different. They were ingrained from a very young age. It was basically woven into the fabric of their upbringing.
Right. And that had huge consequences for how women were able to participate in society and for how their contributions were valued.
But you did mention earlier that Nai wasn't inherently seen as less important or less ethical than Wei. Can you unpack that a bit more? Because it seems like there's a potential contradiction there.
Yeah, that's a really important point. While women were confined to the nice sphere, their roles within that sphere, especially the role of motherhood, were highly revered.
That makes sense. I mean, you can't have a functioning society without mothers and caregivers.
Exactly. And the Confucian ideal of a benevolent ruler was even described as being the father and mother of the people. The figure of Mengmu, Mencius's mother, is still a powerful symbol of maternal wisdom and influence. Even the marriage rite itself, as described in the Liji, initially shows a lot of respect for the bride.
Like how so?
Well, the groom was actually expected to act like a servant, helping the bride into the carriage and things like that. And crucially, unlike some Western philosophers of the time, Confucianism didn't explicitly say that women were intellectually or morally inferior to men.
That's a pretty big difference when you think about the intellectual landscape of that time period.
Yeah, it is. And texts like Liu Xiang's exemplary women's biographies actually apply the same virtues to both men and women.
So, if women weren't seen as inherently inferior, where did the hierarchy come from? If it wasn't about some essential difference between the sexes, what was it based on?
It was really rooted in this Naiwei division, particularly within the spousal relationship. The husband was supposed to lead and the wife was supposed to follow. So it was this power differential based on their roles within the family structure, not necessarily on any inherent differences in their capabilities or moral character.
But even if that power dynamic wasn't based on some idea of female inferiority, it still restricted women's opportunities to participate in society more broadly, right?
Absolutely. They couldn't hold public office, they couldn't travel freely, they couldn't even really form friendships outside the family.
Wow, so their lives were really circumscribed by these social expectations tied to their gender.
Yeah, it was a pretty limited existence compared to what was available to men. And you see this reflected even in the way Confucius himself interacted with women. He traveled all over, engaged in philosophical debates, advised rulers. That kind of life just wasn't an option for women, even if they were equally capable. He even seemed uncomfortable around women who challenged those expectations.
Like when?
Well, there's the famous story of Nancy, a powerful concubine. Confucius was really hesitant to meet with her, and even when he did, it was only after a lot of pressure from his disciples. And he also explicitly excluded King Wu's wife from his list of capable ministers. So even though he didn't necessarily say women were inherently inferior, his actions suggest that he still saw them as primarily belonging to the nice sphere.
It's almost like the system itself limited even the most progressive thinkers of the time.
It really does make you wonder what could have been if women had been given more opportunities to contribute to intellectual and political life.
Now, I know we've been painting a pretty restrictive picture of women's roles in Confucian society. Were there any exceptions to this? Weren't there some women who managed to break out of those limitations?
Yeah, there were some remarkable exceptions. Ban Zhao, who we mentioned earlier, is a great example. She was a Confucian scholar official who achieved some pretty amazing things, especially considering the constraints of the time.
Remind us what she did again.
Well, for one thing, she completed the History of Han, which is a massive historical text. She also taught palace women and even male scholars in the Imperial Library, and served as an advisor to Empress Dowager Deng, who was basically the ruler of China at the time.
Wow, so she was clearly a brilliant and influential woman.
She really was. And maybe even more importantly, she wrote the Admonitions for Women, or Nuji, which is considered the earliest extant text advocating for equal education for women.
That's huge. So even within this system that was generally pretty restrictive for women, there were individuals pushing for change and challenging those norms.
For sure. But we do have to acknowledge that Ban Zhao's achievements were largely due to her family's status and the fact that she was widowed. She wouldn't have had those opportunities if she hadn't been born into a wealthy, scholarly family and if her husband hadn't died.
So it's not like the system itself had changed. It was more about her unique circumstances.
Exactly. Her case really highlights the limitations of the Neiwei division. Because even this incredible woman who achieved so much still had to work within the confines of a system that didn't really allow women to fully develop their talents and contribute to society in the same ways men could.
It's like those exceptions prove the rule, in a way. They make it even more obvious how unfair the system was for the vast majority of women.
Right. And this brings us to another key concept, which is the idea of female dependency, which is really central to maintaining that Neiwei division.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned the Sankong, the threefold following.
Right. It basically says that a woman should follow her father when she's young, her husband when she's married, and her son when she's widowed. So it's this idea that a woman is always dependent on a man, that she can't really exist independently within society.
It's a pretty stark contrast to the Confucian ideal of the self-cultivating individual, isn't it? Like, how can a woman truly cultivate herself if she's always supposed to be following someone else?
Yeah, it's a valid critique. Now, to be fair, some scholars argue that the Sankong doesn't necessarily mean blind obedience. They say it can also be interpreted as reliance or guidance, which might be a bit more nuanced. And there are certainly examples of women who, even within this framework of dependency, were able to exert influence and make their voices heard.
Like Mengmu again, right?
Yes, she's a great example of how, even though a woman was supposed to be subservient to her husband, she could still hold significant power within the family.
But ultimately, their power was still tied to their relationships with men. It wasn't like they had independent authority within the system.
Right. And alongside the Sangkong, there was also the side, the four womanly virtues that women were expected to cultivate.
And those were.
Virtue, speech, comportment, and work. They were basically the guidelines for how a woman should behave, especially in her role as a wife and mother.
So kind of like the Wulun, the 5 social relations that guided men's conduct.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And Banzhao actually argued that cultivating the side was just as important for women as cultivating Ren, benevolence, was for men. So it's not like these virtues were seen as inherently inferior. It was more about how they were applied and the context in which they were practiced.
So while the virtues themselves might have been considered equally important, the scope of their application was drastically different for men and women.
Exactly. Which brings us to a really interesting genre of literature, the Nu Sishu, or Four Books for Women. These were texts written by women for women, starting with Banzhao's Nuji.
And these were basically instruction manuals on how to be a good Confucian woman.
In a way, yes. They emphasize things like wifely obedience and filial piety. But what's fascinating is that, despite their often conservative content, these texts actually helped foster female literacy, authorship, and a sense of gender-based consciousness.
So wait, are you saying that these books, which were meant to reinforce traditional gender roles, actually ended up empowering women in some ways?
That's the paradox. By creating this space for women to read, write, and think about their experiences as women, these texts inadvertently contributed to the development of a distinct female voice within Confucian society.
It's almost like those in power always underestimate the potential of literacy and education to inspire change, even when they're trying to control it.
It really does make you think. And Banzhao's Nuji is a perfect example of this. She's advocating for wifely servitude on the one hand, but on the other hand, she's making a pretty bold argument for equal education for women. She even subtly subverts the Liji to support her point.
Sneaky. I like it.
She had to be strategic, but the message is there. And these texts weren't just about teaching women how to be good wives and mothers. They were also providing them with a space to engage with intellectual ideas and develop their own thoughts and opinions.
And this was happening despite the limitations placed on them by the Naiwei divide.
Right. These texts provided a kind of safe passage for learned women to pursue intellectual pursuits that were normally reserved for men. And the authors of these books, women like the Song Sisters, Empress Rangxiaoan, and Woman Lu, were often exceptional individuals who challenged those limitations in their own ways.
So it was like this literary tradition created a sense of community and intellectual lineage among women, even within a society that wasn't really set up to support their intellectual endeavors.
Absolutely. You see authors like the Song Sisters explicitly invoking Banzhao as an intellectual predecessor, and Empress Rangxiaoan even aimed to write a book that would surpass the Nuji in scope. And Woman Lu's writings are even more radical. She actually argues for female superiority in some ways.
Wow, so this wasn't just about accepting their subordinate position. These women were actively engaging with Confucian thought and reinterpreting it in ways that challenged those traditional hierarchies.
They were definitely pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for women to think and write about. And it's important to note that throughout all of this, the concept of patrilineage looms large.
Right. It's been a recurring theme in our conversation. So how did this emphasis on patrilineage, on continuing the male family line, impact women's lives?
Well, it was pretty much the defining factor in their social worth. Despite these exceptional women we've been discussing, for the vast majority of women, their primary value was seen in their ability to bear sons and continue the male lineage.
That's a pretty heavy burden to carry.
Yeah.
Like your entire worth is reduced to your reproductive capacity.
And it's reflected in the Lianu, the biographies of exemplary women that were used to teach moral lessons. Early on, these biographies included virtues that weren't necessarily gender-specific, but even those virtues were often framed in the context of how they served the patrilineage.
So even when a woman was being praised for her courage or her intelligence, it was always tied back to how those qualities benefited her husband's family.
Yeah, that was the underlying message. And in the post-Han period, these Liannu narratives become even more focused on explicitly female virtues like wifely fidelity and widow chastity. The state even started awarding honors to chaste widows, basically encouraging women to remain loyal to their husbands even after they were dead.
Wow, it's like they were completely erasing a woman's individual identity and reducing her to her role in the family.
It's a pretty bleak picture, and it stands in stark contrast to the Lizwan, the biographies of exemplary men, which focused on their individual achievements and their contributions to society at large.
So for men, it was about what they did in the world, while for women, it was about their relationships to men.
Sadly, yeah, that's how it often played out. And this emphasis on patrilineage also had some really disturbing
How
consequences.
so?
Well, it led to practices like female infanticide, where families would kill baby girls because they were seen as less valuable than boys. And it also contributed to the acceptance of concubinage, where men would take multiple wives or concubines in order to increase their chances of having a male heir.
It's like these women were caught in a system that didn't value them as individuals, and it put immense pressure on them to produce sons, even if it meant enduring terrible hardship and sacrificing their own well-being.
It's a tragic aspect of this history that we can't ignore, and it raises some really tough questions about how to reconcile this past with modern feminist values.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about how contemporary feminist theory has engaged with Confucianism, because it seems like there's a lot of tension there, given the patriarchal aspects we've been discussing.
Yeah, it's been a complicated relationship. Western feminist theory has often focused on gender as a central analytical category, and a lot of that work has involved critiquing the Western philosophical canon from a feminist perspective.
So looking at how those philosophical ideas have contributed to gender inequality.
Exactly. But when it came to looking at non-Western traditions, there was this tendency to view them through a lens of universal victimhood.
Meaning,
Like, there was this assumption that women in all these different cultures were basically victims of patriarchy and that their cultures were inherently oppressive to women.
so it was kind of a one-size-fits-all approach that didn't really take into account the complexities and nuances of different cultures.
Right. And there was this tendency to portray Western feminism as the more enlightened and liberating force. Foot-binding became a prime example of this.
Because it was seen as this barbaric practice that exemplified the oppression of women in China.
Right. And the thing is, there's actually no direct connection between foot-binding and Confucian philosophy. But the two have often been conflated in Western discourse.
It's almost like foot binding became a symbol of everything that was supposedly wrong with Chinese culture from a Western feminist perspective.
And that's a problem because it reduces a complex cultural phenomenon to a simple caricature.
It's a reminder that we have to be really careful about imposing our own cultural values and assumptions onto other cultures, especially when we're talking about something as sensitive as gender.
Absolutely. And for a long time, this kind of critical, almost judgmental stance was the dominant way that Western feminism approached Confucianism. But around the mid-1990s, things started to shift a bit. Scholars in comparative philosophy started pushing back against these simplistic portrayals and started to explore more positive comparisons between Confucianism and Western feminist thought.
So they were looking for common ground rather than just focusing on the differences.
Right. And one area where they found some really interesting parallels was between care ethics, which is a feminist ethical framework that emphasizes relationships and empathy, and the Confucian concept of ren, which is often translated as benevolence or humaneness.
Because both of those concepts are about interconnectedness and our responsibilities to each other.
Exactly. And this marked a pretty significant turning point in the conversation because it opened up the possibility of a more productive dialogue between Confucianism and Western feminism.
It's like they were acknowledging that wisdom can come from different sources, and that maybe Confucianism actually has something to offer contemporary feminist thought.
Right. But there was still some resistance from within the feminist community.
Why?
Well, some care ethicists were worried that incorporating non-Western traditions would dilute the feminist message, or that it could be co-opted by more conservative agendas.
I can see how that would be a concern. It's like you don't want to lose the hard-won gains of the feminist movement by trying to find common ground with traditions that have historically been patriarchal.
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge that those concerns are valid. But despite those reservations, there's been this growing movement within feminist philosophy to engage with Confucianism in a more nuanced and open-minded way.
And that's where the idea of Confucian feminism comes in.
Right. It's basically this forward-looking project to develop a feminist theory that's grounded in Confucian concepts and methods, rather than just applying Western feminist frameworks onto Confucianism.
So it's about drawing on the strengths of both traditions to create something new and potentially more relevant to the challenges women face today.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's about taking Confucianism seriously as a philosophical tradition that has something valuable to say about gender and about how we can create a more just and equitable world.
That's pretty exciting, actually. So, what are some of the key tenets of this emerging Confucian feminist approach? Like, what are the big ideas they're working with?
Well, one of the central ideas is what some scholars call the rectification of Naiwei. They argue that the rigid gendered division between the inside and outside spheres needs to be rethought in light of modern understandings of equality.
So, basically, challenging that foundational division that we've been talking about all episode.
Exactly. And one way they propose doing this is by reimagining the spousal relationship, which has historically been pretty hierarchical in Confucianism, as a relationship based on friendship.
Hold on, friendship. Like replacing marriage with friendship.
Well, not literally replacing it, but conceptually reframing it. Because in Confucianism, friendship, or you, is based on mutual trust or sin, and it's not as rigidly tied to gender roles as the traditional spousal relationship.
Oh, okay, I see. So it's about shifting away from this idea of a husband leading and a wife following and moving towards a more egalitarian model based on mutual respect and shared goals.
Precisely. And this idea of friendship as spousal relationship has some really interesting implications. For one thing, it could potentially address the gendered division of labor by emphasizing reciprocity and shared responsibility for things like housework and childcare. And it could also be more inclusive of same-sex relationships, which challenges the heteronormative assumptions of traditional Confucianism.
So it's like taking a core Confucian concept, friendship, and using it to reimagine the very foundation of family life in a way that's more equitable and inclusive.
Exactly. And another key concept is the idea of relational personhood and dependency care. Confucianism has always emphasized the relational self, meaning that our identity is formed in relation to others, which contrasts with the Western focus on the autonomous individual. And this emphasis on relationality ties in really nicely with care ethics, which also emphasizes the importance of relationships and our interconnectedness.
It's like saying that we're not just individuals floating through the world. We're embedded in a web of relationships, and those relationships shape who we are and how we understand ourselves.
Right. And Confucianism also recognizes that we're all dependent on others at different points in our lives, which has some interesting implications for how we think about caregiving.
Because it suggests that caring for others isn't just a personal choice or a private matter, but a social responsibility.
Exactly. Confucianism actually sees a role for the state in providing care for the vulnerable, like widows, orphans, and the disabled, which is a pretty different perspective from the more individualistic approach that's often taken in Western societies.
It's a more collectivist view that recognizes that we all have a stake in each other's well-being.
And this brings us to the final point, which is Ren as feminist care. One of the criticisms of care ethics is that it can reinforce traditional gender roles by putting the burden of caregiving primarily on women.
Because it's often women who are expected to be the nurturers and caregivers, right?
Right. And Confucian feminism tries to address this concern by arguing that caregiving responsibilities should be more equitably distributed among all members of society, not just women.
And they see the concept of Ren, of benevolence and humaneness, as being central to achieving this.
Exactly. Because Ren is all about recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every human being and treating them with compassion and respect. So it's a really powerful concept for grounding a more inclusive and just approach to caregiving.
It's like saying that caring for others isn't just about fulfilling a duty or a social obligation, but about actually seeing the humanity in each other and responding to that humanity with kindness and generosity.
And that vision of a more caring and compassionate world aligns really well with the core goals of feminism, which is ultimately about creating a better world for all people, but especially for those who have been marginalized and oppressed.
So it seems like Confucian feminism is offering a really unique perspective on some of the biggest challenges we face today, challenges related to gender, caregiving, and social justice.
It's a really exciting and evolving area of thought, and I think it has the potential to make a real contribution to how we think about these issues going forward.
Wow, this has been a truly mind-expanding deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the historical construction of gender in Confucianism to the emergence of a contemporary Confucian feminist movement. It really highlights how valuable it is to engage with diverse philosophical traditions, especially when we're trying to grapple with such complex and multifaceted issues.
I completely agree. It challenges us to think outside of our own cultural boxes and to consider new perspectives that might not have occurred to us otherwise.
And as you, our listeners, continue on your own philosophical journeys, we encourage you to reflect on what we've discussed today. Think about the Confucian emphasis on relationality and care, and how a more friendship-based understanding of relationships might reshape our current debates about gender roles and social responsibility. Because sometimes the most unexpected sources can offer the most profound insights. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Confucian thought.